Welcome to Trash Compactor. I'm Josh, and if you haven't figured it out by now, we here at Trash Compactor are just as interested, maybe sometimes even more so, in the behind the scenes stories of how Star Wars came to be and why it is the way it is, as much as the content of the movies themselves. And I'm joined today by a special guest who is also a Star Wars behind the scenes nerd. I hope he'll forgive me for using the term to discuss one of the most fascinating figures in the making of Star Wars, Marcia Lucas. He hosts my favorite Star Wars podcast, Talking Bay 94, which is devoted to interviews with the cast, crew, and creators from a galaxy far, far away, where he takes a weekly deep dive into some never before heard stories from the set and Skywalker Ranch, from background aliens to some of the biggest stars in the universe. I am so pleased to welcome Brandon Winerdy to Trash Compactor. Hello, Brandon.
Hello, thank you so much for having me, and also those very kind words. Very unnecessary, but thank you.
I mean, I'm not just blowing smoke. Talking Bay 94 is my favorite Star Wars podcast. I think you do a phenomenal job over there. Like some of the conversations that you've had, like I literally, as I'm sure you can relate, you think you've read all the things and heard all
Mhm.
the things and seen all the interviews and all the making ofs. And then whenever you come across a story or a point of view about the making of these movies that you've never heard before, it's kind of like, whoa, like where how did I not know that? And so many times when I'm listening to you interview one of your guests on one of your episodes, I'll get like a nugget, a window, an insight that I'd never heard before. So I quickly became very addicted to Talking Bay 94. And so thank you for the work that you do and all your contributions to Star Wars lore.
I appreciate that. Thank you for those kind of words. Yeah, it's been a trip because I watched and I've always been watching those same documentaries and reading the same books that you were mentioning, and so being able to talk to so many of the people that are referenced in there or that are major parts of those books is just like is a real dream come true. And so I always have to pinch myself that then also people listen to my stuff, and I'm able to tell some of their stories that might not have been told before.
No, absolutely. So, yeah, so that was one of the reasons why I wanted to have you be the one that I have this discussion about Marcia Lucas with. For any listeners who aren't aware, Marcia Lucas was the wife of George Lucas. She was a film editor in her own right, and she contributed a lot to the creative decisions behind the scenes of the original Star Wars trilogy and also American Graffiti and George Lucas's other films. And since their divorce in 1983, she has, stayed out of the public eye. And for reasons that are probably understandable, has never really factored in much in terms of the official making of materials. And it's not until I think the last few years, really, where, a lot of people kind of realize that there's a Marcia Lucas sized hole in the story of the making of these films. And that combined with her sort of reemergence in the public, she gave her first, I think, on camera sit down interview for that Vice documentary series that came out around the same time as Light and Magic, I believe. When did you first become aware of Marcia Lucas and the role that she played in the making of the original trilogy?
Yeah, for sure. I think the biggest mention of her in any like catalog of Star Wars, behind the scenes stories comes from the Skywalking biography by Dave Pollock, which was written during a time when George and Marcia are still together. So Dave Pollock goes to Skywalker Ranch, hangs out with George Lucas for a very long time, and is also hanging out with Marcia that entire time as well. And it's during the fraying of their marriage, which is an interesting perspective during all of these conversations. But she is a major presence in all of the stories and all of the conversation and how that book is put together, which makes it an invaluable bird's eye point of view resource, because it really is kind of maybe the most unfettered version of it all that we have. Of course, once you see that, once I saw all of that, I kind of then went further in. She's mentioned briefly in Empire of Dreams a little bit. There's always that famous photo of her and George on the editing bay. The Rinsler book does a little bit to talk about her. But since those Rinsler books were so closely worked on with Lucas, right? J.W. Rinsler, amazing, incredible, uh, the most important figure in behind the scenes Star Wars. But since Lucas was so tied to those, there were not a lot of mentions of Marcia, and then it became a little bit of an interesting revisionist history in a good way, over the past, like you were mentioning, about decade or so, that Marcia and her involvement has really come into play, um, and her slowly coming back into the spotlight after the Disney sale has been very interesting. As you mentioned, most recently there was that Icons Unearthed documentary, which I watched, which we can talk about. You can talk about it here. I was not a fan of it, and how it was put together.
No,
I
I
thought it,
mean, the Vice series very much has a specific narrative that it
yes,
is,
which is not, yes,
no,
no.
which is
So
also like, very much like the Vice way. It's like, here's the real story that they're not,
sure, it was
telling.
what's the word? It was unfortunate for that filmmaker, a filmmaker in quotes, that his documentary came out at the same time as Light and Magic, which was potentially one of the greatest behind the scenes, things in a long time. And
Yeah.
the fact that they were coming out at the same exact time was an interesting choice. But before that, she had spoken at that Academy presentation, which, yes, I heard that she was going to be there. It was right before the pandemic, and so I flew out to LA. I live in Texas. I flew out to LA for one night and went to that just to see her talk. Which is, Ben Burt was there, John Knoll was there, John Dykstra was there. It was them inducting the Dykstra Flex into the Academy. It
Oh,
was an
that's what it was. Yeah.
incredible night. And so she was there, and then she was actually supposed to make a second appearance at USC, that I had tickets for, that I was going to fly back out for again, just to talk to a smaller group, just a night with Marcia Lucas. And that was literally, I think it was slated for like April 2020, and that got
Ooh.
canceled and then never happened, obviously. Besides that, she's made a couple small appearances at the 40th anniversary celebrations of both Star Wars and Empire, which they have out at, it's called 3010 Studios, which is where the original ILM was, where the original Kerner Optical studio was. And so
Oh,
you'll see
wow.
some pictures of a lot of the, Phil Tippett's and everyone all getting together, and having this party that I am very jealous of. But then Marshall will always go because she was their kind of, she was like the mother of ILM, the mother of Lucasfilm, right? She was the one that was putting together all the parties, all the Thanksgivings, all that stuff. And so she goes to those. George does not go to those. And it's an opportunity for everyone to like see her again, which is very interesting. And so there's a couple of videos of her being interviewed at some of those events as well. Um, and then that's pretty much it. She also, the major one though, recently, I don't know if you had a chance to read it, is the Howard Kazanjian biography, um, which is it's J.W. Rinsler's last book. I think he might have a Shining book still to come out, but it's his
Oh, yeah,
last
that's
book.
right. He passed away last year, I believe, or
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah,
You, by the way, have a phenomenal interview with him that I just
thank you,
that
thank you.
that it's so wonderful that there are conversations with him that
Yeah.
exist for posterity because he died far too young. Um,
Yeah, he is probably, probably my greatest inspiration, but also, like you were saying, just an incredible man and resource. And I was very lucky to get to talk to him a couple times, but then especially that was very early on in the podcast and really kind of cemented how I interview and how I talk to people. But in that book, Howard is the one that was like, if we're doing this story, I would love Marcia to tell some parts of it because she was there for so much of it. And so she agreed to really come out of retirement and like talk about Star Wars publicly, for the first time, since Jedi. And so that book came out. I got an early copy of it. And I read it very quickly, and it was wonderful. And her parts were very good, especially during the making of everything, because it was really a really good perspective of what George was saying, what George was thinking, what she was saying and thinking when these movies were blowing up. And then, of course, Reddit and the YouTube channels and stuff picked up what she said at the end of the book, which is all about the sequel and prequel trilogies and how she feels about those, which she is very much entitled to her opinion. We don't have the same opinions about stuff, but it's very interesting her going to see, let's say, The Phantom Menace, which is directed by her ex-husband, edited by her friend Ben Burt, right? And a story that she's very familiar with. And so she was very negative towards the prequel trilogy, very negative towards the sequel trilogy, which is, again, very understandable if you're that close to something at its inception, but was an interesting kind of, period, to put on her statements. So again, I'm very glad that her story has been told. I think that's the closest we'll ever get to like an official Marcia Lucas biography. Um, Hopefully I'm proven wrong, but that's my thought for now. And it was a very interesting way to get it. So that's kind of the current Marcia Lucas communications history. But all of that paints a very vivid picture of someone who is very, very talented, and then who was kind of stunned away for a while. And now, oh, I'm glad is being able to tell her story and her perspectives.
So let's talk a little about Marcia Lucas's specific creative contributions to Star Wars. So she was not originally slated to work on Star Wars beyond just sort of being the proverbial supportive spouse, despite being an editor in her own right and having previously helped George Lucas's previous film, American Graffiti.
Yeah, it was initially, well, first, it wasn't even going to be, we know, of course, of Paul Hirsch and Richard Chew, but it was going to be this, I think his name was like John Jimpson, a British just union editor, like, right, that was very much just like the day in, day out, just tradesman. But then that obviously rough cut was terrible, so they brought it to the United States, and it was going to be Richard Chew and Paul Hirsch, and then she came in and helped, especially with that last final act.
So let's get into that because, yeah, like you said, the original editor, the British editor, not only did he sort of have a very classical, straightforward sense of how to cut a movie, but he also didn't really get the film.
Right.
And it seemed like he was really playing up the goofiness of it rather than treating it with a finer touch that it's supposed to be dramatic, and he just made some very wrong decisions. So to put it lightly, but if you could discuss a little bit, is like you said, Marcia, the bulk of her work was really on the ending of the movie, the end battle over the Death Star. If you could talk about why that was and what her changes were,
For
her
sure.
innovations that improved the
Well,
film.
it even goes beyond. I think Death Star is the best way to frame what she was doing, because I mean, obviously, before they came back to the United States, she was responsible. It's a story very famous now of her um, convincing George to kill Ben Kenobi, right?
Oh, right, yes, right, of
As
course.
kind of the, and initially it wasn't even like you should kill Ben Kenobi. It was someone needs to die, someone needs to be in peril, because otherwise they just escape the Death Star with little to no, effort. And so first, I think she said shoot 3PO, and he did not like that because he loved the idea of the droids being kind of the bookends of the movie, which makes complete sense. And so then it was Ben Kenobi, and of course, talking to Alec Guinness about all that was a whole other thing. So when they came back to the States, then she had a few other things, some humor. I think she's been described as like the heart of Star Wars, right? So anytime there was a little bit of humor or anything, George was always very ready to cut it out, and she was always there to say no, like leave that in. Let's let it breathe. Let's let it have some joy. I
So
think
which
the
is
mouse
super.
droid is one of
Yes,
her. Yeah.
yes, the mouse droid in particular, I know the running up and Chewbacca scaring it, and it sort of runs away scared. Like I remember I've heard that anecdote that she fought to keep that in. But hearing you say that is actually really funny because, one of the charges leveled at George Lucas is his like quirky sense of humor. That's the quote unquote problem that a lot
Mhm.
of fans have with some of his films. But what you're saying is that Marcia, in this instance, was the one who was like, no, we need the lighter moments and keep those funny
Yeah.
moments. And George was the one who was actually resisting it. So that's
I mean,
interesting.
yeah, I mean, if you think about one of their biggest points of at least filmmaking contention is THX, where it was so dark and dry and impersonal, that film, and for good reason. I think that's one of the main purposes of that film, but it does not have that much humor or thought. It's very, very somber, and she really did not enjoy that. And obviously, that's the part of Lucas. And then American Graffiti obviously balances that very well, almost skews more, you would almost classify it as a comedy. And so this, I think he was going back towards the THX mindset, but without realizing how much of the success of American Graffiti came from the humor, came from the warmth, came from the joy.
Well, so because it's also interesting because Star Wars is like the hybrid of THX
Right.
and American Graffiti. It's like if you put THX 1138 and American Graffiti in a blender, or if they spawned a child, like it would be Star Wars.
Right.
But that is interesting. Like a part of me wonders, if like he was also resistant because it was such a. I think he was potentially afraid of not being taken seriously.
Yeah, it's also just an interesting, like, him world building for this movie. And I mean, even those early drafts of Star Wars, we view them as early drafts, but you approach them as something that he wrote maybe a year or 2 years before he was filming, right? Like, the turnaround
Right.
time of some of those early drafts to the final product is actually a very short amount of time, and some of those early drafts are so more leaning towards the THX 1138 side of things, right? Are so inaccessible, are so I mean, I think they're wonderful, but they would not have been as as well received by a general audience. And so you
Certainly.
get to a point with the filmed Star Wars, and you have 90% of it, but like he is still working through those thoughts and those drafts. And it isn't until you get to Empire and to Jedi when you actually have the actors and they feel comfortable in their skin. You have Harrison Ford. You have these characters that are not just, sketches and not just drafts. And then he's able to kind of build from there. But you also think about the prequel trilogy, they're goofy. There's goofy elements, but maybe doesn't necessarily have the same amount of character charm. I think there's a lot of charm in the movies, but like,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. Sort of that, like, yes, yes.
so
I would
anyway,
agree with that.
all that to be said, she helps with that aspect of it, and then the actual editing process, as you were kind of hinting at, like the Death Star battle itself, that third act. I believe there was only 2 passes at the Death Star in the initial element, and she adds the third pass, and she adds the ticking clock, right? She adds the Death Star is in range sort of thing, right? Adds that extra element, and adds the third pass. And really, if you watch the movie, she doesn't reuse shots, but they had to like carefully re-edit that movie and slot in things that were not ready to go, in order for that to really work, which is really masterful.
No, totally. Like, if you watch that sequence with this knowledge in mind, you realize that it's just shots of Leia looking worried and 3PO looking worried and Peter Cushing looking vaguely concerned, and the voiceover of the countdown and the graphic of the countdown saying they're approaching Yavin and within range and all that stuff. They actually reuse the firing sequence from the destruction of Alderaan to totally create this whole sequence that was not conceived of in the script, was not shot that way, was not like, so that is really a creation of Marcia Lucas. And it's crazy to imagine that sequence without any of that stuff.
Yeah, for sure. It is again, really showcasing all of her chops, right? She was not able. I mean, what she was able to do with those scraps is really incredible, right? And that carries through. The Raiders example is obviously she didn't edit Raiders, but her adding the final scene or like convincing them to add the final scene with Marion, because otherwise Marion would not have had a conclusion.
Right.
Crazy.
She asked, so what happened to Marion? Right? It's like,
Yes.
and then and then it's sort of like, yeah, the only woman in the room is like, so what happened to the woman, right? And it's kind of like, oh yeah, I guess we should add a scene. Um
Crazy.
um so I just want to clarify one thing. You said
Yeah.
that there were 2 runs on the trench and she added a third. I thought that there were 4. Like,
And she
so
took it
Luke
down?
Yeah, so Luke made
Let me
one
see.
run and was unsuccessful. He used the targeting computer and he missed the shot. And then he took a 4th run where he decided to shut the computer off.
So I kind of like the four rounds almost make more sense, but I just haven't seen that as much as I would like. I don't know if you ever read The Secret History of Star Wars? That's
Yes.
like, yeah, that's where I saw the 2, and I'm trying to find that right now. Yeah, the 2's in there. Um, but
So I believe where I'm getting mine from, I think was from Marcia Lucas's mouth from the
mm,
Vice documentary.
from the Vice. Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So that's what she said.
Interesting. I like that. I can talk about Return of the Jedi really quickly. There's not like that much because really with Jedi and with Marcia, again, it's Dwayne Dunham and Sean Burton
Yes.
are the editors for that, and she comes in to really help with the third act. And this is while they're like either about to get divorced or in the middle of kind of like this whole upheaval, and so things are very tense. But she comes in to help, especially with the emotional beats, is what I've always heard. I think Lucas
Yeah.
described it as like
The crying and
uh
dying scenes.
the crying and dying scenes, yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's all the emotional stuff of that third act, which is a big part of it. It's the Luke and Vader and finding out that Leia is his daughter. That whole element I've always associated with Marcia. Um, but again, like, it's not necessarily like building it up from scratch. It was more that was such a complicated end, almost even more so than the trench run, right? Because you're cutting between um
Three
the
massive
space
set pieces
battle,
that are going on.
Endor,
Yeah.
and Death Star, which is crazy. And so I think she just kind of came in to lend a helping hand through all of that. Um, and then, and then she is no longer a part of it after that.
Something else that she said that I had never heard, again,
Mhm.
from the Vice documentary, obviously there's that very famous disastrous first screening that they had for all of their friends. And Brian De Palma in particular, he kind of tore into George Lucas and like really thought he was about to tank his career. And like he was just laying into him. Like even when they went out to dinner afterwards, he was just like really laying it on. And one of the things that he said, that Marcia said, he said, was, "What is with this force shit? Like, I don't even understand what it
Right.
is. Like, you got to get rid of that." And Marcia says in the documentary, the next cut she saw, George had taken out many of the references to the Force, a lot of the May the Force be with
Hmm.
yous and stuff like to downplay that element. And according to her, from what she said, within the last year on camera, she told George, no, you have to put that stuff back in there. That's what this movie is about. You need the Force. Forget what Brian says. Like he's wrong on this one. Like you
Yeah,
need to keep that stuff, which I have never heard anywhere. But knowing how down Brian De Palma was on the movie, that kind of struck me as having a ring of truth to it.
for sure. And also, it falls in line with what Marcia has said about like the May the Force be with you being a little bit tied to her religious beliefs growing up as well. Is kind of
Mm.
like like that spirituality aspect of it all. She felt very comfortable with, and I don't think she didn't claim the phrase "May the Force be with you," but like it kind of went hand in hand with it all. So that would make sense, and would also track with what we've heard about how Brian De Palma felt about
Yes, totally.
yeah.
But I do want to talk about the Vice documentary for a second because same as you, I took issue with the framing and the very clear sort of narrative agenda that it had in mind. It seemed like it like had a specific perspective that it was trying to sell. But that aside, the on-camera stuff with Marcia Lucas and even some others like Howard Kassanjian and stuff, like having these people say these very frank things on video, I thought there was a lot of value in just seeing Marcia say certain things in her own words, like things, frankly, I never thought we would ever know or hear her say. And I mean, again, like a lot of the animosity or the opinion she has regarding the prequel trilogy and the sequels is totally understandable. But like hearing her say that after she saw the Phantom Menace, she went out and cried in her
Right.
car in the parking lot, like just I'm not really crescendoing to a point here. It's just sort of where I just never I was really shocked to hear and see some of those insights from her. That again, as a figure who has not been sort of part of the Star Wars story for such a long time, to all of a sudden see these candid moments with her, I thought was really it was very emotional.
Yeah, it is. I think emotional is a good word, just in general for for the Marcia appreciation. I think you were balancing it a little bit with how you were talking, because I have such deep appreciation for George and such deep respect for everything he did, and that entire team is so vital to the success of each of those movies. Each of those movies is a miracle movie of those first six Star Wars
Yeah.
in various capacities. And I think it's very easy to have a non-nuanced conversation about Star Wars. I think as evidenced by many YouTube channels and many Twitter accounts, right? And I think coming to Star Wars with an open mind and an open heart and an open realization that it was made by people, and it was made by humans, and it was made by people that are flawed and that have opinions that have, I think, makes it almost a more powerful story and a more powerful piece of filmmaking, a piece of media that we've all latched onto in a variety of ways. And I think taking, let's say, the original Star Wars, for example, and the idea that you were floating, that some people say like, oh, like George Lucas isn't anything. The only reason that it was successful is because of this person, this person, this person. I would uh agree to an extent. Obviously, George is a very inexperienced filmmaker during Star Wars. He has a ton of ideas that are just like overflowing. And then he gets to England, he gets to Tunisia and experiences, more stress than he's ever had in his entire life. And he comes back, and Islam has never finished a shot. And you're like, okay, well, what are we doing here? And I think you look at that original Star Wars and you look at people like Ralph McQuarrie, like John Williams, like Ben Burt, like Dykstra, like Edlund, like Dennis Muren, and like Marcia, and all of them with George in this like symphony working together, discordant at times, sure, but in the end, creating a product that has literally stood the test of time. Goes a lot further than saying, "Oh yeah, George Lucas would have made a terrible movie without Marcia Lucas." Um, because probably Star Wars would not have had the same impact if we didn't have the second run on the Death Star. If we didn't have Kenobi dying, all these things that Marcia impacted. If you took all the impact she took out of it, you're left with probably a very compelling sci-fi movie, and probably one that we would still be like, that was a really great movie, and I bet we would have gotten a couple sequels from it, but maybe it wouldn't have been what we have today. Who knows? Who really knows? But Marcia's involvement is so tied in with Star Wars as kind of like the heart of Star Wars, and something that we love, and I don't think is necessarily not present if she doesn't isn't there, because saying that she's the heart of Star Wars implies that George doesn't necessarily have a heart, right? uh but I think George intrinsically is a humanist, right? And is intrinsically like, here's who people are, but maybe he's not the best at expressing that, right? He wants everyone to have that same reaction that he does, without necessarily like realizing that other people have different life experiences he does, or whatever it might be. And I think a good example of that is THX, a movie that Marcia did not like, a movie that I really like, but it is a very cold movie. It is a very, like, compared to a Star Wars, I could see a world where the original Star Wars is a THX with a bigger cast and more special effects and a little bit more of a hero's journey, but still not the heart that we come to for Star Wars. I think that's kind of the key with Marcia, and I think there's a discussion of like, did George lose that when he hit the prequels and he didn't have Marcia, and like, well, the quote unquote, the people listening can't see me, the people that are like, oh, Lucas had only yes men around him, and that's why the prequels suck. And I'm like, I don't know, like, I think the biggest flaws of Star Wars are present in the prequels. And I think the biggest successes are present in the prequels. I think it's all very relative to how you experience things. I'm sure her presence is very much missed in terms of that editing, but I think you have people again like Ben Burt literally learning how to edit and becoming the editor of Attack of the Clones or Revenge of the Sith as they make stuff up, and how to do digital editing with the edit droid. So again, it's all very relative, and it's not black and white, which is why I think this conversation is so invigorating and so interesting to talk through, because we still don't know everything about what happened behind closed doors, but we can at least use it to add to our appreciation of these movies.
No, absolutely. And not only that, like, even if we did know everything, I think it would still be sort of a question like, well, like, who's really responsible for what? Because, the filmmaking process is so collaborative and ideas are so sort of intangible. Like it's an interesting counterfactual. Without Marcia Lucas, what would the original Star Wars have been like? We don't know what solutions, what other ideas would have been arrived at without her presence. So we can't really say exactly what. So it's like you can't really separate it. It's like a hard sort of a question to even like, what is the value of the question in the first place? It's like, well, it like
I
would have
love
been
that.
something else. We don't know what it would have been, right?
Yeah, what is the value of that? Who cares? Like, I guess we're getting to a point with Star Wars, we're 45 years on now at this point, right? And it's just like, we might have run out of things to talk about, in a sense, in a layman's sense, because I think we see this all the time. I don't know if you ever say, oh, I'm a Star Wars fan. I always get the same 5 things from people where it's like, oh, like the Darth Jar Jar theory, or like the prequels,
Right.
like there are like 5 things
Yeah.
that people say. They're like, oh, I love Star Wars. Have you seen this? Have you seen this meme? Have you heard about Kathleen Kennedy being fired? Like, it's all these like weird behind the scenes lore aspects that aren't necessarily true or real, but it's like what people gravitate towards, because like we've almost run out of truth. We've like run out of the elements of Star Wars to pour over from a layman's perspective. I think you can really dive in. I think there's still a ton of props we don't know the lineage of, right? We don't know how they built X, Y,
Sure.
or Z, right? Which is so interesting and so crazy, right? Or we don't know, the aspects of the original cut or like anything like that. But like we've gotten to a point with Star Wars where it is probably the thing in movie history that has the most behind the scenes content for it, right? The
For
most
sure.
behind the scenes books and shorts and specials, and also what I mean, Lucas, even more so than being an influential filmmaker, really pioneered like the importance of behind the scenes documentaries and books and storyboard books and whatever it was, because he knew how important that was and wanted that carried through. And you see that later on when he just has film crews doing, Phantom Menace and everything like that. And so we've gotten to a point where we've seen so much, and now every time like StarWars.com publishes something and I see like a 1 second clip from a behind the scenes, shot in at Elstree, I'm like, oh, we haven't seen that before. Like stuff exists that we haven't seen, but like how much will it add to the tapestry? Yeah.
So I want to qualify what I'm about to say by acknowledging that you and I are speaking about the experience of a woman from the perspective of two cisgendered men.
Right.
Um, or actually, I apologize. I shouldn't assume that you are
You have
cisgendered, but I
you
feel like
assumed correctly. You assumed
yeah,
correctly. Yeah.
I just feel like you shared enough like childhood photos that I was a safe
Yeah.
assumption. Okay,
No,
sorry.
yeah, you assumed correctly.
Yeah. But so yeah, so we're two men and we're talking about the experience of a woman. So I just want to acknowledge that. But how much of this erasure, well, I guess erasure at worst and kind of overlooking at best, how much of Marcia's absence from the story of Star Wars do you think has to do with sexism, with the fact that
Yeah. I
that she's
think
a
I
woman?
mean y- it's interesting to me because even while they were together, right? It wasn't as if as soon as they got divorced, she was erased from the archives, or she was erased from all the speaking. Because, like, I mean, she went to the Academy Award, and she's in that one photo, and like, she goes to award shows with him. But really, the only in period time that we see is in that Skywalking Dave Pollitt book, right? Is when she's ever really, really mentioned for being this incredible editor and like someone that has worked on some of the best movies of all time before Star Wars and has her own career and is her own person. We don't, at least now looking through all these documents, we don't have that much from that time, which leads me to believe that, yes, I think a lot of it was George hurting and George wanting to separate himself from it and wanting to begin the story. And we're talking a little bit about like how he always has mythologized himself, right? But like he wanted, I don't think he wanted to like take credit, but I think there was an amount of mythologizing happening around the creation of Star Wars from the first movie, right? I mean, like you have a making of Star Wars book, you have the art of books, you have the blueprint books. Like he was very on top of creating behind the scenes footage for that movie, which is rare for movies like that at that point in time. And she was not present in a lot of that, right? Like she was not there. Like we did not have the trench run story in any of those 70 to 80 books, right? Otherwise, you would think that would be in there. You'd think that that'd be a story that's like, oh, my wife helped me with this movie. Here's what she brought to the table, right? Like, I don't know. It seems like something that would cross my mind if my wife was helping with a movie. Um, and so that's one element of it. And I think the second element of it is someone that is separated and someone that is divorced and getting cheated on. I think then he really reacted incredibly poorly, but also like you understand his mindset where you're just like, I'm just gonna never think about her, talk about her again, and let her take none of the credit. Like it's not her thing.
No, totally. But the other thing about like when I say her erasure, it's beyond just from her contributions to Star Wars. Like she was an accomplished editor in her own
Yeah,
right. She edited a bunch of movies for Martin Scorsese. Like you mentioned, she was the reason why Scorsese hired Paul Hirsch. She edited New York, New York at Martin
yeah.
Scorsese's request. Like it has to do with the dynamics of the divorce and like who gets whose friends
Because
and
he got all the friends, right? And that really hurt her. That's been something that she's been very public about. Is like they would go to the same stuff. They would hang out with the same people, right? They had the same group of friends, but all the friends, I don't know whether they decided to go with George or it was naturally just like we want to hang out with George, but like she did not have any friends after that. Like they
well, Yeah, well, so that's sort of what I'm getting at here. Like this idea that in the 70s and 80s, and I mean, things have improved, but not as much as I think people would like to think. But like Hollywood was a boys' club,
Right.
especially the new Hollywood of the 70s. Like I just think there was no conscious exclusion, but I think it was out of sexism. It's like, well, obviously, like we're friends with George,
Right.
and like, and I mean, this is our club. It's too bad that we can't see Marcia anymore, right?
Right.
It's like it's sort of my sense of it.
Right.
Why didn't Marcia Lucas ever cut another movie for Scorsese again? It's hard to untangle. Like, I know that one of the points of contention between her and George was that she really, it's like, okay, we've had all this success, we have all this money, now let's have a family and let's have a life and enjoy ourselves a little bit.
Right. And he couldn't.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, that's not really him. And that was, sort of the flaw in the design of the Death Star that ultimately led to it blowing up. I mangled that analogy, but you get what I'm
No,
saying. It was
no, for
it was
sure.
the fatal flaw. Like it was the small exhaust port right below the main port that blew up their marriage.
You're crazy.
I might have to cut that out. That's rather
No, I think that was
embarrassing.
good. I think it was good.
Okay, appreciate it. One other thing that I just feel compelled to mention is that you mentioned, Marcia cheated on George with the man who she eventually married after she divorced George. She claims emphatically, again, in the Vice documentary, that
Right.
she never cheated.
Mhm.
And, I know that that's sort of a he said, she said thing.
Yeah.
But up until then, in my mind, the story was always she
Yeah,
cheated
that's
on him.
yeah, very interesting for
And there
sure.
was never like any question about that, like as far as I was
Yeah.
concerned.
Yeah.
But she was in tears and she was like very emphatic that she was never, never unfaithful to George while they were married.
Mm.
Which I just think is worth
That
is
is
worth
very
noting.
much worth mentioning for sure.
But anyway, why do you think Marcia Lucas has reemerged now to tell her side of the story to get well, I mean, her side of the story, but
Yeah.
but to give these interviews? Do you think it is because of the Disney sale and the fact that George Lucas isn't running everything?
I think that's exactly what happened. I mean, if you look at it, right, Disney Sale was what, 10 years ago now at this point or something like that, which is
Yeah, yeah,
crazy.
it's 2012. That is crazy.
The first time I saw her pop out in person was then in 2015, whenever when was the 40th anniversary of 2017, 40th anniversary of New Hope, when they had the event. And so there was a video of her. There was it was like a dual interview. You can find it on the internet still, with her and Dwayne Dunham for like 4 minutes
Oh,
of just Marsha being like, "Hello, I'm Marsha," and then talking about like something. And it's on some random Vimeo channel. And I was just like, what is going on? So you trace that 2017 to now 2022. You skip the pandemic in there. And so she makes that appearance in 2019 at the Academy. And I think it's her just slowly kind of realizing that people are interested in her story. She's also been out of the public eye for such a long time that I do feel like you get to a point where Star Wars is not only the biggest thing in the world when you are married to someone, but then is the biggest thing in the world with the prequel trilogy when you're separated from it, and then the biggest thing in the world again with the sequel trilogy, right? It's had two more moments of relevancy, and so with this third time, I bet she felt like, hey, like we're removed from it. George is removed from it. If someone credible came calling, I will say something, right? And again, the moments that we've had, besides the Vice documentary, which I don't know how they swung that. I, I'm not gonna make this a bash session because again, like we were saying, everything takes hard work to produce. But that one, anyway. But for something like the Academy, for something like the Howard book, it was very specific, very intentional things that were
mm,
asked of her. And I think that's if we ever do see something like that from her in the future, it will be something of that caliber. Um,
mm,
and again, I think it's just, time doesn't necessarily heal wounds, but it does help with certain aspects of it. And again, I think there have been a lot of people talking to her. I know that like the Hamills are still in touch with her. Like there are some elements that are still in touch about certain aspects of everything. And so um I think she's being a little more comfortable. And we'll see if that continues. There was going to be an autograph signing with her 2 years ago, which got like she was on board and then got canceled at the last minute. Just like interesting things like that. So we'll see if that continues. I almost hope that it doesn't. And maybe, and honestly, it might have stopped now just because of the reaction that that Howard book had in a negative way. And the people that coordinated that really were bummed because it took away from Howard's story and it became just
Mm.
like a something for the internet to argue about for a week, which really bummed me out too. I was like, this is, but again, she's entitled to her opinion. But it was more just how people responded and respected that. It kind of rubbed me and also just the people that were helping coordinate that the wrong way. So we'll see if that continues. But yeah, just a fascinating time to get all this information all of a sudden. Really the final puzzle piece of a lot of stuff.
My issues with the Vice documentary aside, like there were some things that she said that I thought were very revealing and very I don't want to say shocking because that, makes it sound salacious, but it's
Right.
sort of, she very much gave confirmation that George was basically so hurt that he just wanted and wants nothing to do with her. And I can understand from her perspective, well, okay, well, if that's what he wants, then I will
Right.
stay away. And I think that selling Lucasfilm to Disney kind of creates that room for her to sort of reemerge because now all of a sudden George Lucas isn't everything Star Wars.
Right.
He's not in control of what is seen and like what is said. And so I do think that that has a lot to do with it, that she sees that it's not exclusively his turf anymore, so it's sort of okay
Right.
to kind of emerge without risking upsetting anybody. But something that was really striking to me, seeing the Vice documentary released so close to Light and Magic, to your point earlier, I almost have to wonder whether or not that was intentional counter programming, right?
I'm
Yeah.
sure
So,
yeah, I'm sure they were like, "Oh, this documentary's coming out, let's also do it at the same time." And it was intentional in that sense. I think that they were just misjudging the quality of what they had. Compared, they're like,
well,
"Wait a second, you're telling me Lawrence Kasdan directed something? Let's go up against it." It was like a
well,
real
so
Ants Bugs Life situation.
Well, so so out of curiosity, and again, like this wasn't the making of Star Wars. Light and Magic was about industrial light and magic and was about much more than just
Right.
the making of Star Wars, even though that was sort of the cornerstone of the whole thing. But for example, because it was Lawrence Kasdan who, is certainly friends with George Lucas and is, making a product for Disney and Lucasfilm and for Kathleen Kennedy. Like, I very much get the impression that they all still want to respect George's feelings,
For sure.
especially when it comes to things like re-releasing the original unaltered trilogy and how it depicts George Lucas's role and Marcia in terms of the official story about the making of the films. Like I get the sense that, Lawrence Kasdan would not have called up Marcia Lucas and been like, "Hey, would you sit down for an interview with me?" Just because that's sort of not what you do when you're making something official about Star Wars.
Here's it's very interesting again, like you mentioned, having Lawrence Kasdan as the director of a project specifically for Disney, for Disney Plus, and working alongside ILM, you do give up a small amount, right? You do give up a tiny amount of what's the word? Like you have to assume that Disney definitely made a pass through it and was like, you need to take this out, you need to take this out. That being said, I was very surprised with a lot of the candor that was in that documentary that I was not expecting to see. For instance, the Dykstra Lucas beef was in there almost to the full. I think they coded it a tiny bit, but overall, people were very upfront about it. People were very reflective on it. I think it was very interesting and a very interesting example of something like the Marcia George part of it all, of how that could have been approached. That being said, of course, they not in a million years would they've ever touched it inside of that documentary specifically. And I don't think they really needed to. I don't know if that documentary would be better or worse if there was a whole thing about like, Marcia saving it in the edit and then, what happened with Jedi and what happened after it. Like, does that really impact how the story of Island being formed? is
Right.
created, right? Like if you view it as that through line of that thesis statement, then I mean, Marcia is obviously a part of it, but she's not like the main driving force. And then on the flip side, you have Icons Unearthed, which I guess I don't know what the thesis of that story is, which I think is the major flaw of it. I really don't know what like he was trying to say beyond like I loved the first two movies and hated everything else. Here's a bunch of people that worked on them
Who
to maybe
who
corroborate
who
that.
agree with me.
Uh,
Yeah. Oh, well, that's sort of what the thesis is, right? Like, it's sort of this very tired narrative about how George Lucas isn't really the genius everyone thinks he is, and I'm sort of tired of
I'm so
that,
tired of it. I'm so tired. I
that
don't
narrative.
care. I don't care. I don't care. You know what I mean? I'm just so tired of it. And
No, I don't care. It's just an exhausting thing to listen to because it's so much more complicated than that.
right.
Like, there's so much it it's so much more complicated than that. So I sat down to watch it just out of kind of morbid curiosity because I knew that the Marcia Lucas footage was in there and I just, wanted to see what she would say. And I mean, let me put it this way. Like, I would never recommend the Vice documentary to anyone who doesn't already have a very familiar and intimate knowledge of the making of those
Right.
movies, because I think it leaves you with a false impression of what actually happened. But that said, like I do think there was enormous value for just the Marcia interview alone. But so I would like to ask you a terrible question, and I apologize in advance.
Okay.
So you're about to do the last episode of Talking Bay 94. You have interviewed everyone that has had anything to do with the films in any capacity at least 4 times over. And your final episode, you have an opportunity to interview either George Lucas or Marcia Lucas, and you can only choose one because the other will refuse if you interview the other. Who would you choose for your final installment?
I'm so glad you phrased it that way
Why?
because I am on record. I'm on record saying that if I ever interview Marcia Lucas, which is an enormous if, that is a a minuscule chance that will be the last episode of Talking About 94.
Really?
Because that's it. What George, I would never say no to interviewing George, obviously, in a hypothetical. But George has been interviewed so many times, right? Like by
Right.
interviewing George, you're going up against thousands of interviews, right? Thousands of well documented, well accessible interviews. If you're interviewing Marcia, you're going up against 4 interviews, right? Like that's it. The potential to actually ask interesting questions, which has not been done very much, right? Again, the you know is incredible, and for an interview, and also for a fan of Star Wars, and also a fan of Marcia, it would be the ultimate kind of opportunity. With George, I've always people are like, oh, what would you ask George Lucas? I don't. There's really not that much left to ask George. I think Paul Duncan, who wrote the Archives books
Mm,
for Taschen, did a really incredible job recently, especially in the prequel archive, of interviewing George in a way that not a lot of people had done before, which was really going towards his inspirations, to what he was reading right then, to what he was thinking about. And that's how we got a lot of this really interesting information about like midichlorians and what his plans for the sequels were, right? It was a very free flowing, interesting thing rather than being like, all right, tell me about the inspiration for Star Wars. Like you liked Flash Gordon, like what's going on, right? And so he did it in a way that I really related to, where he talked about comics, and he talked about art, and he talked about humans, and he talked about philosophy. And that's a very tough interview to prepare for, but also not necessarily like a good quote unquote Star Wars interview.
mm,
Um, it's a good philosophy interview, and I think one day I'd be very interested in tackling that, especially when the museum opens up. I bet you'll get a
mm.
few more of those kind of pieces, and I would love to be a part of that somehow. Because again, asking George about Star Wars at this point, I'm kind of tired of. Like, I really don't almost want to. Like, what is he going to say beyond like almost every time he's asked about the holiday special or about whatever, it's always kind of a revisionist history, and you're like, well, there's no point in
Well,
asking. You might as well
yeah.
ask him like. So
Right.
anyway,
Yeah.
that's a
Well,
long answer of saying yes, Marsha, 100%.
well, no. Well, I mean, I agree with you exactly. Like, it's also, not only do we know a lot of, or basically as much as we're ever going to know about things from George's point of view, it's also his answers through no fault of his own. Like, this is it's just what happens when you're talking about the same thing over time, over decades and decades. But like his answers have kind of calcified a little bit. And
Yeah.
you used the phrase revisionist history. I think that what happens over time when you're trying to reduce what is a complex series of events and thoughts that you are recalling from your own memory, that over time, the more you recount it a certain way, the more you come to really remember a version of things that never actually happened exactly that way. Like, because it's so complex, and like when you have to come up with an answer to the question, like when did you get the idea for this, or what was the inspiration behind this, like you end up constructing a narrative that over time becomes in your mind true. Like
Right.
the idea that the much discussed and oft debated question about like how much of the overall story of Star Wars was planned out from the beginning. And it's like,
Mhm.
it's not that Darth Vader was always George Lucas's father per se, but there always was a father figure, and there always was like this fascination or this interest in themes about fathers and sons and the generations, and like what we get from the past and all that. So in a sense, like, yes, that's always what the story was about. But in another sense, like, I'm a firm believer that when they were making the original Star Wars, that the idea that Darth Vader was actually Anakin Skywalker was not a glimmer in
Yeah.
anyone's mind. It's just very clear. Like when you watch that movie, like that's not who that character is. It's
And it
just
also
not how
doesn't
you would.
matter. It also doesn't, yeah, it's very interesting, like you're saying, him being like, "Oh, it was always the plans. What's going on?" Like, no, like we know it wasn't. And it's fine. You like him again, that's why it's been interesting, because him trying to appear not human almost, right? Him being like, "This is
Yeah,
how I've always wanted it. Here's what I've always demanded." And even things like, for instance, the thing I always love is not only like, okay, release the original cut, blah blah, blah, who cares, right? Please do, but like, I get it.
yeah,
Um, but if you ever go and look up the storyboards for the Jabba scene in A New Hope that gets inserted, and you're like, oh, like it wears what's his name, Declan Mulholland, right? Like,
yeah.
okay, like I want to see, it had to have existed, but there's no trace of that. There is just versions of Jabba with Salacious Crumb, who does not exist until 1983, right? But of that Jabba in that scene, and then that's inserted into the books as if that was what was going on. That was always the plan, and that's what George always wanted. Is like, no, like he had a general idea that he wanted something non-human, but then wasn't able to do it. Like it wasn't like, oh, I wanted a slug guy who looked like this.
Right.
That was never the case, right?
No, and you can tell because of the way the scene was staged. Like we see it on screen in the special editions. Like there's no way that Harrison
Yeah.
Ford walks around the character if he's supposed to be a slug, right? But anyway, um, I digress. So, but yes, like I think that interviewing Marcia, there's the opportunity to hear things and hear a point of view, learn things that you would never get from interviewing George Lucas. Like if the goal is to learn more about how these films were made, I think interviewing Marcia is the way to go. Do you think it'll ever happen?
I don't know. I'm not gonna say it's gonna happen. I will say it's now more possible than ever. Obviously,
Yeah.
if she's willing to do it, obviously I'm not gonna like email her this week or whatever it is. I've gotten close is the wrong word. I've gotten closer than ever before in terms of finding the correct contact information. It really will have to be something very special and something very important. It might not be for Talking Bay. It might be for something else, but it'd be very cool if that ended up happening, and I hope it does. I'm not holding my breath, but I hope it does. You're catching me on a very optimistic day. I interviewed someone today who I've always wanted to interview, and it was not for Talking Bay. And I was like, okay, we can check that off the list. It happened. So who knows? Who knows if Marshall ever come to pass? I hope so.
I hope so too. I would love to hear that interview. Is there anything that you wish people would stop saying about Marcia Lucas or George Lucas or her involvement in the movies that people would just like know or stop saying, like you actually don't know what you're talking about?
If it's wishes for what people would stop saying, that's a very long list. And it's everything that we've talked about during this entire interview. And I think it's more of a general thing, which is just like just having an element of good faith in how you consume
Mm.
media, and I think is so important, especially when it comes to something like Star Wars. And like, obviously, you and I have been talking for an hour and have had just a great time just talking about something we love, but are both coming at it from the same way, which is these are movies that were made for 10-year-old boys in 1977 and are really important parts of our lives that we are very happy exist, but are not perfect and are not things that can be like, observed religiously. And it's important that we just like take it as an important thing in our lives that brings us joy. And as soon as it stops bringing us joy, and as soon as we start looking for things to like make us dislike something or make people the villain in this story that we are creating on our own, it's like, what's the point? Go read a different book, go watch a different movie, and find something you enjoy. And I hope Marcia has found things that she's enjoyed beyond filmed editing, and with her family and with her life. And I'm always grateful for people that know her name now. Maybe in not the context that I was expecting people to know her name, but I'm glad that people are starting to come around to the importance that she has. Um, but again, everything is nuanced, and please do more research than YouTube channels. Unless Trash Compactor has a YouTube channel, then please just go to the Trash Compactor YouTube channel.
Thank you for the plug.
But that's it. Yeah.
We do actually. I second everything you just said. I think approaching the media you consume in good faith and not assuming the worst intentions or the worst about. Yeah, I mean, we want to like things. I want to like things. I don't want to not
Right.
like things. I'm not like, looking for things to hate on. It's just like, yeah. But that's a topic for a whole other episode. If you like this discussion, please listen to Talking Bay 94, which you can find at talkingbay94.com. Brandon is Talking Bay 94 on Twitter. Are there any other avenues you'd like to plug? I mean, if you search for Talking Bay 94,
You'll
it comes
find
up.
it.
It's
Yeah,
what
it'll
comes
be
up.
there. It'll be
It
there.
comes up.
If you want to pick up, I get no money from it. But if you pick up Star Wars Insider from the past few issues, I'm in there interviewing people as well at the official Star Wars magazine. So
Oh, yes, I
if you're
forgot to mention that.
if you really want to read more of me, that's another way to do so as well. So that's it.
Uh,
Yeah,
you have a piece on the special editions. Is it already out or is
it's
it
already
coming?
out. I'm very proud of that. It took a lot of effort and work. I think I interviewed 10 people for it as an oral history. Very, very proud. Dennis Murin was one of them, but also people like Dave Carson and Don Bees and Nelson Hall. Really, I'm very, very proud of that, because the special editions do mean a lot to me. Is how I first watched Star Wars,
Uh,
and so I always have a very special place in my heart for them, and I'm very grateful that they allowed me to do it, because I feel like some people don't like talking about it. But yes, that I forget what issue that's in, but that should be able to pick up just at your local comic book shop or something like that, and check it out.
oh, that's very cool. So, yes, Google Talking Bay 94, it's what comes up. And if you would like a transcript of this conversation, please visit trashcompod.com. And we are TrashCompod across all social media. And we will see you on the next one.